Throughout art history, there has been one inescapable constant, a force so fundamental yet boundless that every masterpiece from Renaissance ceilings to modern day paintings relies on it. For centuries, it lingered in the background, unspoken and underappreciated, but as time marched forward, it was studied, revolutionized, and reimagined into shaping our world, even though most people still overlook it. We're talking about color theory. And we're talking so much about color theory that I'm splitting up this video into 2 parts. In this part, I'm going to show you all the practical color theory that you'll ever need and more. And in the next part, we're going to take a deep dive into the history of color theory and explain how we got from mixing paint to UC Berkeley literally yeeting laser beams into people's eyes to create colors that no human has ever seen before. It's actually pretty cool. You should look it up. Recently, the game I've loved since childhood has been taking a turn into a more artsy direction. Structure and organic building has been leveling up big time because creative builders have been pushing the boundaries of what's possible inside of Minecraft. But the reason that these Minecraft artists know how to create things that I'd hang up on my wall is because they all started their understanding of color with the color wheel. The color wheel being the face of color theory should be pretty familiar, but one thing I see a lot of people saying is that the primary colors are red, yellow, and blue, or that red, green, and blue are the primary colors. But neither the RYB or the RGB models really give us the whole picture. When red, yellow, and blue paint are mixed, they create green, orange, and purple. And then those colors, which are called the secondary colors, combined with the primaries make tertiary colors. That's where the classic 12-spoke color wheel comes from. Now, there are 2 color wheels that you might have seen that seem very similar but have one major difference. Obviously, one of these has a white center and the other has a black center, but why is that? It comes down to the color model being used. The RYB wheel, red, yellow, blue, is the traditional color wheel used in painting and physical media. It's a subtractive color model, meaning that as you mix more colors together, they absorb more light and get darker. That's why the center is black. If you mix all of your paints, you'll end up with a muddy brown or, in a perfect world, black. The other wheel is RGB, red, green, blue, which is used for light-based color like screens, digital art, or just anything with pixels. It's an additive color model, which works by adding light. The more colors you mix, the brighter it gets, and if you mix all of them, you get white. That's why the center of the RGB wheel is white and the RYB wheel is black.
And in the region of overlap of all 3 of the lights, I see a combination that looks very much like white light. Using just 3 colors of light, I can create many other colors. In fact, all the colors necessary to have a color television, for example.
So the difference isn't just visual, it's about how the colors behave in different mediums. If you're working with paint or physical materials, you're using red, yellow, blue, but if you're working digitally, you're in the world of RGB. Both wheels are very useful, but which one you use depends entirely on how you're applying color. I'm going to explain this in more detail in part 2 of this video, so make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss that.
Hey!
Oh, shit.
You forgot something.
I forgot, red, blue, mixing paint.
What'd you forget, Snarple? Come on.
Oh, CMYK.
CMYK, that's right.
Oh.
So, you're going to explain it, right?
I don't,
Snarple, come on. Snarple. Okay, guess I'm doing it. CMYK is a subtractive color mixing model and stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and key plate. In terms of printing presses, the key plate is the plate that prints the details and lines after the color is printed, usually in black, so nowadays the K just stands for black. The CMYK model was discovered by James Clerk Maxwell in 1867, but didn't become widely used until 1906 when the Eagle Printing Company showcased just how many colors it could really make. When mixed, cyan and magenta make blue, and yellow and magenta make red. Now that red and blue could be mixed from other purer colors, the red, yellow, blue model became obsolete in terms of accuracy. When we see color, we are seeing light, and our eyes perceive that light using the red, green, blue model. We are trying to mimic that using red, yellow, and blue, but it wasn't quite enough. Turns out, cyan, magenta, yellow is the exact inverse of red, green, blue. The colors we needed were right there all along, but we just didn't have the pigments to make it possible until the 1800s. Many painters still use the red, yellow, blue model, which is why I refer to them as the painter's primaries. But it's becoming more and more common to use the CMYK model now that the pigments are readily available. Both models have their limitations. Red, yellow, blue lacks a lot of greens and purples, while CMY can be lacking in terms of orange, but CMYK overall has a much wider range than red, yellow, and blue.
Every color can be split up into three parts: hue, value, and saturation. Hue is color. It doesn't refer to how light or dark something is, just specifically what color is it. Colors can change in terms of value and saturation, but still be the same hue. The spectral hues, which are listed on the color wheel, are the groundwork for what's possible, but currently the Pantone color system offers about 10,000 unique hues. Colors like black, gray, and white are referred to as achromatic because they lack hue, but in general, they're still referred to as colors. Saturation, or chroma, refers to the purity of a color. Desaturated colors have less hue than maximum chroma colors, which is just a fancy word to say fully saturated colors. And value is how bright or dark a hue is. Bright colors contain more white, and dark colors contain more black. Pink would be an example of a high value red, and maroon would be an example of a low value red. A color palette is a grouping of colors. Color palettes are basically like cheat codes for your builds. As long as your color palette is solid, you're like 70% of the way to making something that's pleasing to look at. So here are the 8 most common color palettes in order of how complex they are. Starting off super simple, complementary colors are colors that are opposite on the color wheel. Combinations like red and green, yellow and purple, blue and orange should seem very familiar because they're the most common color combinations for things like brands, products, sport teams, etc. But they should also feel very easy to look at because our eyes naturally enhance these color combinations. Split complementary color palettes consist of a base color and 2 to 3 colors on the opposite side of the color wheel. It's pretty similar to normal complementary, but it gives a little more versatility. Triadic color palettes are 3 colors that are equally spaced on the color wheel. The most common example of this is red, yellow, blue, which happens so often because those also happen to be the primary colors. Analogous color palettes are a group of 3 to 5 colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. These kinds of palettes are super common in like nature settings usually. Tetradic colors, also called square colors or double complementary, is exactly what it sounds like. The reason you would say tetradic colors rather than square colors is because oftentimes the square becomes more of a rectangle and there are 2 sets of colors that are a little closer together than the others. But overall, they would both fall into the category of double complementary. Anything more than 4 usually isn't worth defining, but 5 is called pentadic, and anything over that you would call a polychromatic palette, which means multicolored. Monochromatic color schemes are also really popular, so you probably already know it means singular color palettes. But sometimes I see people mistake analogous color palettes for monochromatic because their colors are very similar. So just to clarify, if an image has 2 colors that are really similar, like dark blue and light blue, it's not monochromatic because you have 2 different hues. Similar to monochromatic is a grayscale palette, which is called achromatic rather than monochromatic. There are also warm and cool palettes. Warm colors are the colors red, orange, and yellow, and cool colors are the colors green, blue, and purple. One thing that our color palettes don't take into account though is value or saturation. It's really rare, often only happening in pop art, to have color palettes that look like this, where we're only using hues with no variation in value or saturation. To explain why this is important to our Minecraft palettes, which most often present in the form of gradient boards, I want to show you guys a couple examples of palettes that could easily be improved when you have an understanding of hue, saturation, and value. Alright, so starting off with our first example, we have kind of this silly looking gradient, but I think it's pretty important because it shows our first element of color. The main issue with this gradient is the hue, and that's really easy to see because we can define these colors pretty easily. Luckily for us, this gradient doesn't change in terms of value or saturation that much. I'm really only worried about going from yellow to blue. Kind of in the middle of what this gradient is going for is kind of like a green green color. We need to find a color that's in between yellow and lime glazed terracotta. The first block I kind of think of is the melon block, and I also know that sponge and wet sponge are also very kind of yellow-green colors. So melon on the green side, sponge is a little more on the yellow side. And then I'm going to back up and kind of evaluate what we have. Melon is far more dark than our other blocks, so that's not really going to work. And then I'm going to move our wet sponge over, and actually I'm very, very happy with this already. Now we need to find something that's kind of in between this blue and this really bright green here. And so I think prismarine is a pretty greenish aquamarine blue. At least in my hotbar, this looks pretty good. So I'm gonna plug these in here. Now I'm not a fan of the transition from the prismarine to the lime glazed terracotta. That seems a little bit harsh because this is a bit darker, has a lower value. So here we have a much better gradient, one that actually follows the orders of hues of yellow and blue mixing to make green, and then having kind of a yellowish green and a greenish blue here. So on to the next gradient. What I would do to find out whether these blocks are in the right order is I want to see what's kind of going on in terms of the actual colors of these blocks. So I'm going to go to my color picker in Axiom. I'm going to be paying attention to where the hue slider is, and I'm also going to be paying attention to the value of the colors. Value changes when I slide up and down on our color picker. Darker values are at the bottom and lighter values are at the top, and you can kind of see that on the display here. The other thing I'm going to be paying attention to is the saturation of the colors. So much more saturated colors are towards the right, and desaturated colors are going to be towards the left. From looking at these, I can definitely say that red concrete is going to be our darkest block. And I'm also pretty confident red wool is going to be next. It's definitely darker than the other blocks here. I'm not as confident about our red concrete, red mushroom block, and red glazed terracotta. All right, so the first block I'm going to plug in here is our red mushroom block. So this one is super saturated and it's super bright. And I want to pay attention to where the other two blocks are in relation to this. So I'm going to plug in our red glazed terracotta next. So as you can see, this kind of shifted a little bit to the left and down, which means it's a little more desaturated and it's a little darker. And then I'm going to plug in our red concrete powder, and that is even darker and even just slightly more desaturated. So the order that this would go in is actually red concrete powder, red glazed terracotta, and then mushroom block. Now this last block is really, really interesting. I have no idea where this block is gonna go. So this kind of went in the middle. It's definitely far more desaturated. These blocks are very, very consistent in terms of their saturation. And I think throwing this block in there really just kind of throws it off. So I would actually make this a 5-block gradient like this rather than the 6-block gradient that we have here. So our next example comes from a builder friend of mine. On one end, we have kind of this brown block, and then on one end, we have the warped planks. The interesting thing about this gradient is that the saturation and brightness change quite a bit towards the middle. These two blocks, when we plug them into our color picker, they're roughly the same saturation. They're basically the same brightness too. So these blocks are actually really, really similar. The only thing that changes about them is their hue. Rather than transitioning through something that is super desaturated, I want to try to keep the level of saturation here. Brown being orange on our hue slider, and blue being down here. In the middle would kind of be like a green block. I'm gonna say our green wool is gonna be our first pick, maybe moss block as well, prismarine, and also deep slate emerald ore. I think that moss block is going to be the closest thing to our oak wood, then maybe green wool. I think this deep slate emerald ore would be closest, and then maybe the dark prismarine into our warped planks. I'm not 100% certain on this, so I'm going to throw this into our gradient helper and see if there's anything in the middle. And unfortunately, it doesn't really look like there's much in there. Then I'm gonna see on our blue side, going from warped planks to deep slate emerald ore. So it looks like the only thing that we would add in here is possibly the diamond ore, but I think this could be a pretty short gradient. So I'm actually just gonna delete our dark prismarine, and I'm gonna have our deep slate emerald ore there. Then I'm gonna move this over and see if there's anything in between deep slate emerald ore and green wool. And it's saying that moss block is actually in between these, But we know that moss block is also in between green wool and our oak wood. So we don't actually even need this green wool because technically this block is closer to deep slate emerald ore and it's also closer to our oak wood. So this whole gradient can be summed up in these 4 blocks rather than transitioning through a really desaturated color like this one here. If we keep our saturation the same, we don't need to use as many blocks to transition. A lot of the time, we do actually want a lot of variation in our build. So if we're gonna stick with something like this, a couple edits that I might make is this packed mud is a little bit brighter than this light gray terracotta and also this brown concrete. So we might wanna find something that's a little bit darker. Something that would maybe be in the middle of this is, immediately I'm thinking like dirt, maybe coarse dirt could go in the middle there, something like that, which makes it transition a little bit better. And then also our wax exposed copper actually fits really well right here, which means that we can just move this whole gradient back over. And by instead of having the light gray terracotta and having the dirt block in between our packed mud and brown concrete, our gradient actually just got that much better. Now that we've seen hue, value, and saturation in practice, it's time to talk about different ways that we can use those colors. Contrast in art is the deliberate arrangement of opposing elements to create visual interest in a work. Not all color palettes have a high amount of contrast, which is why it's crucial to understand the importance of contrast separately from the importance of palette harmony. Subtle contrast can create things like depth or harmony, while dramatic contrast can create things like focal points, intensity, and interest. The 7 contrasts of color were first laid out by Johannes Itten, and they're basically a guideline for understanding how color actually works in a composition. A color palette can look nice, but without contrast, it's gonna feel flat. These contrasts are how you get something to pop, or how you get something to feel calm, or even just how you guide someone's eyes around a piece. You probably used a lot of these without even realizing it. The first one is the contrast of hue, which is the most basic one, and as you could probably guess, it's just the difference between colors. Most of what we went over with palettes has hue contrast built in, except for the ones that intentionally exclude diversity. It works best when the hues are far apart on the color wheel, kind of like complementary colors. The more space between them, the more they're gonna stand out from each other and the more they contrast. The contrast of light and dark is also really common and super useful, but unfortunately isn't really shown by the color wheel. This one's all about value. You can use any hue, but if a color is lighter than the other, your brain immediately reads where they meet as contrast. This is one of the best ways to create depth or make a focal point in an art piece as well. Our eyes naturally tend to land on contrast, so keep that in mind when you have lots of contrasting values. The contrast of warm and cool is kind of self-explanatory since you already know what warm and cool colors are, but if you put a warm color on top of a cool background, it usually jumps out, and same thing in reverse. It's a great way to direct attention or create a mood in an art piece. The contrast of complementary colors is what we already talked about earlier, colors that are opposite from each other on the color wheel. The contrast of simultaneous contrast is a little trickier, but it's basically an optical illusion that happens when you put one color next to another color. The surrounding color usually changes how you perceive the original color. So if you put gray next to blue, it might tend to look a little more orangish than it does on its own. It's really useful when you want to mess with perception or fine-tune how a color looks in a specific context. The contrast of saturation is about how pure or dull a color is. Highly saturated colors feel intense and loud, while desaturated colors feel soft and muted. And you can use this contrast to make something feel vibrant or to pull it into the background. Putting desaturated colors in the background of an art piece is essentially mimicking atmosphere in real life. Contrast of extension, which is sometimes called proportional contrast, is about how much of a color you use compared to other colors. A tiny bit of red in a big backdrop of dark green is going to stand out way more than if the colors were used in a 50-50 split. The contrast of extension is mostly about how to make small accent colors shine. But color contrast can do more than just make colors pop out. Depending on how colors are placed next to each other, some hues might stand out, others might appear to shift, and some might even read as completely different colors. Some of that has to do with simultaneous contrast, but a lot of it is also about color context. The contrast and context go hand in hand, but they are different. If contrasts are the words, then context is our sentence. A super common example of this is how colors will look different depending on what color background is surrounding them. Notice how our red color feels feels different depending on what color background it's in front of. On top of blue, it can feel more vibrant, while on top of orange, it might feel muted or softer. This also applies to value and saturation. A medium value green will look darker if it's next to white, and lighter if it's next to black. A slightly desaturated color might feel completely washed out if it's next to something super vibrant, and that's why palettes look good on paper but can fall apart once they're placed in an actual composition. The colors start reacting to each other in ways that you might not expect at first. If something feels off, it might not be the color itself, but it could also be the color that it's sitting next to, what it's surrounded by, or how much of the color is in the piece. Color context is one of those invisible forces in color theory that you really only start to notice when something feels off and you don't really know why. But once you understand it, you'll start seeing it everywhere, and you'll know how to start adjusting your colors in a way that actually works for your piece instead of against it. Alright, remember to subscribe if you haven't already, because I'll be out with more soon. I love you guys. I hope you have a good rest of your day.